Hello and welcome back to the channel. My name is Eddie Jennings from EJSLLC.com. This video is going to be answering the question of, is Linux on PowerShell ready for production? Before I dive in, I want to thank returning subscribers as well as invite anyone that enjoys the content of this video to click like. And if you haven't subscribed yet, make sure you click the subscribe button and ring the bell when you do so you can be aware of when new content comes available. So is PowerShell on Linux ready for production? If you want the short version of the video, as of now, which is November 2020, it is not. There's a lot of promise with it, but it's just, in my opinion, not quite ready to be used full-time in a production environment. The things that I looked at for this particular experiment slash project was managing a Linux system with just PowerShell rather than using Bash. Also managing a remote Linux system from a Linux workstation using PowerShell, as well as trying to manage a remote Windows system from a Linux workstation with PowerShell. So I'm going to go into each of those things and give you what I found were some of the shortcomings, which led me to the conclusion of PowerShell not being 100% production ready for, or rather PowerShell on Linux not being 100% production ready. When administering a Linux workstation in a shell environment, there are really four things that I want to make sure that I can do. And one is be able to manage processes, manage services, users, and storage. So on my CentOS 8 workstation here, let me launch PowerShell. I have another video about installing PowerShell on a Linux workstation, which you can look, I think it's going to be in the upper left corner of the video. There will be a link to that. So I'm in PowerShell, and if I were to do git command, pipe that to measure object, we see we have 274 commandlets, which is not bad. It's far less than what you would have on Windows. And the commandlets that are available to you, I'm going to pipe this, see, outhost, paging, are not bad commandlets. I don't think they really are bad commandlets, but for those four things that I think are kind of bare minimum you need to be able to do on a system that you're managing with a shell, you really don't have many commandlets for it. In fact, the only one that you would have would be able to work with processes as far as get process and stop process. There's nothing for users, there's nothing for services, and I didn't see really anything for storage as well. Now, I understand why that is for some things. I mean, on a Windows system, when you're using Windows PowerShell, you have the whole .NET framework underneath, and there's all sorts of calls that go into the Windows operating system to be able to do stuff. Here we have PowerShell Core on Linux, and it is simply a shell. Like with Bash, a lot of the commands that you're running in Bash, really those are standalone programs that Bash is running. It's not truly like a Bash program. It's the Bash shell running whatever this other program is, like LS or DF, on and on and on. So you can see why you would have fewer commandlets and such to work with. That being said, just out of the box, for me to be able to say, hey, in a production environment, I can be using PowerShell 100% of the time to manage my Linux workstation, there's still a good bit left to be desired for that. The other thing I considered when determining if PowerShell on Linux is viable for production administration is connecting to another Linux system remotely from your Linux workstation. So that is a fairly easy process. There are a couple of things that you have to be aware of with this. One is PowerShell needs to be installed on the remote system, which is kind of a given, but it's not something that's just obviously there out of the box because PowerShell is not a native thing that's happening on Linux. The other thing that has to happen is you have to have a particular configuration going on in SSHD to be able to make this work. And so first what I'm going to do, I'm actually going to SSH into my server. Believe it's 140. All right. And of course, fat fingered the password the first try. Anyway, so we're here. If I were to, I have to use sudo for this. Vi sshd config. And we're going to go to the bottom or near the bottom, you have to add a subsystem directive for PowerShell. And if you don't do this, if you try to connect with a remote PowerShell session using SSH as your transport, it'll connect and then immediately be dropped without having this particular directive here. And this is actually in the Microsoft documentation. It tells you that you're going to need to do this. So with that there, let me exit out of the SSH session, launch PowerShell again, and we'll enter PS session. We use host name to do this over SSH. If I were to try to use computer name, it's going to complain about WSMan not being available, which would make sense on the Linux system. We have to specify the username. There's also a parameter if you have key-based authentication that you can use that instead of username and password. And with that, we're in. And you actually usually can use your standard Linux programs within PowerShell as well. And we see that this is my Linux server here running. I believe I have CentOS 8 that's running on this. Just like with the workstation version, you have basically the same commandlets available, which in my opinion are pretty limiting as far as the standard things that I would want to do if I'm actually remoted into a server at the terminal needing to do work. When we start doing remoting from the Linux workstation to a Windows server, that's where some of the fun begins. And before I dive into that, I want to bring your attention to a blog post by Jordan Borean, and my apologies, Jordan, if I have butchered your name. He is a senior developer at Red Hat, and he has a great blog post, which I'll link in the description, talking about WSMan on Linux. He goes into a lot of good detail about the challenge of WSMan and why things are the way they are with PowerShell on Linux. And the short version of the story is, in the Windows world, when we're doing PowerShell remoting, we're using WinRM and WSMan basically to make the connections and to have the transport of your objects that get serialized into, I think it's CLI XML, and then on the other end gets put back into the object and such. You don't have that on Linux. So therefore, in order just out of the box, so to speak, to be able to manage a Windows server from a Linux workstation using PowerShell, that Windows server is going to have OpenSSH or some other SSH server installed on it and that service running. That in itself is kind of expected because Windows servers don't come with SSH by default. The other interesting thing was that I found I had to have PowerShell core installed on my Windows server. Of course, all Windows servers come with Windows PowerShell. PowerShell core, which I think is now just named PowerShell, and Windows PowerShell, even though they share parts of their name, are two completely different products. So it kind of makes sense that you might need to have the other there to be able to make that connection. And it turns out that you do. And that's also following some documentation from Microsoft as well. If you're able to do that without having PowerShell core, feel free to leave a comment about how you did it, because I'm quite curious about it. Jordan, in his blog post, goes into some possible solutions with being able to use, for lack of a better phrase, kind of more traditional methods of connecting with PowerShell other than SSH. So I encourage you to check that out. But as far as managing Windows, once you get that connection going, then life is good. So I'm going to enter PS session to my Windows host. I'm using host name because we're doing this over SSH. I believe 55 is this username, and I'm actually using a domain account. I found this worked for both domain and non-domain join machines, the SSH transport. I'm also using user principal name. I did not test this with just SAM account name, but I typically use user principal name when I'm working in a domain environment anyway. And while this is logging in on the PowerShell core, in the SSHD config, if you're using OpenSSH on a Windows server, you will need to add that same directive that we did on the Linux server for the subsystem in order to be able to connect via SSH. And here, if I were to, it's a strange little bug, if I were to git command and just pipe that to measure object, we have almost 2,000 commands versus 287. And I found that this happens to be a domain controller, and I have all the AD commandlets that I would need. So if I were to get all my little AD users, not going to be many because it's just a little test environment, we have our AD users. So that's quite promising, you know, especially if you're really wanting to use your Linux workstation. Maybe you would have a jump box that's a Windows workstation. You PowerShell from Linux to your Windows workstation and do your Windows work. That's kind of cool, but that's not truly administering just from your Linux workstation. Invoke command does work as far as your Windows tasks. There was one example of invoke command that did fail for me. I can't remember exactly what I did to make that fail. I wish I remembered so I could include it on the video. And we'll do the same. We'll do get service this time. And there you have all of the objects that come back via invoke command. The nice thing about this, and this is actually, in my opinion, one of the most promising things, is that this should be returning objects for us, of which then, you know, you can be doing stuff with PowerShell on your local machine and manipulating objects and their attributes, which is quite nice. But again, there's it's just like out of the box. I don't feel like it's ready to just say, hey, start using this 100% of the time, but it's getting there. One other drawback that I found was connecting with Office 365, and that's actually something that Jordan addresses in his blog posts. A lot of the Office 365 work I've done has mainly been with Exchange Online, and I know with the Exchange Online V2 modules, you can actually install the PowerShell module, but you can't actually connect to Exchange Online. So it's like, hey, I have the tools, that's great, but we can't actually connect. And so that's another thing that takes away from being able to use PowerShell on your Linux workstation full time to be administering Windows applications. While invoke command is promising, especially when you're connecting to a Windows system remotely, there are just too many shortcomings, in my opinion, with managing a Linux system, as well as trying to manage like Office 365 services and such, despite having the commandlets be there, for me to be able to say that PowerShell on Linux is production ready. I hope Microsoft continues development with it. I believe it will, because I'm pretty sure PowerShell Core is not going anywhere anytime fast, and there's likely going to be a greater demand for being able to manage non-Windows systems with it, because administrators would like to, you know, have kind of the one shell to rule them all. So I think it does have a bright future, but just as of today, in my opinion, it's not quite ready for full-time production administration. As always, thank you for taking the time to watch the video. If you enjoyed the content, make sure you click like, and if you haven't subscribed yet, make sure you click that subscribe button and ring the bell so you can be aware of when new content is available. Again, thanks for taking the time to watch, and I'll see you the next time.